So, to begin, apropos the topic of conditions of possibility, my intervention here is, broadly speaking, concerned with the relationship between materialism and naturalism. One of my core guiding convictions in what follows is that any contemporary materialist approach supported by the historical riches of post-Kantian European intellectual traditions cannot afford continued reliance upon increasingly contentious anti-naturalist presumptions and a corresponding neglect of the rapidly developing life sciences in particular. More specifically, I am convinced of the ultimate unavoidability of a precise delineation of the natural and material possibility conditions for what comes to exist in the forms of more than natural, dematerialized transcendental subjectivity. With transcendental materialism, the position I defend being an effort to synthesize anti-naturalism a la transcendental idealism with historical and dialectical materialisms in their varying engagements with the sciences of nature. Furthermore, I am interested in working towards a materialism that is stringently atheistic as well as responsive to modern natural science, while remaining nevertheless steadfastly opposed to mechanistic, reductive, and/or eliminative worldviews. Today, my sketch of select aspects of this endeavor will involve a winding tour through certain ideas drawn from Hegel, Lacan, the history of continental philosophy, and recent biology and its branches, among other sources. This is an attempt to condense into a 30-minute presentation some of what is crucial to a project in process entitled Prolegomena to Any Future Materialism. To begin with Lacan, despite his reputation as an avid anti-naturalist, he has no qualms whatsoever about leaning upon certain ideas of nature as components of his theoretical apparatus. Although adamantly opposed to the introduction of a crudely reductive biologism as a grounding paradigm for psychoanalysis, he is not, for all that, categorically dismissive of the life sciences. Once in a while, he even permits himself, like Freud, to voice hopes of eventual biological corroborations of analytic theories. To take just one illustration of this, known to anyone familiar with Lacanianism, Lacan's concept of need, as per the need-demand-desire triad, is bound up with the biological facticity of protracted infantile helplessness, an anatomical and physiological fact of immense import for psychical ontogeny in the eyes of both Freud and Lacan. Arising immediately from the very start of the human organism's existence as a bodily being, need is the contingent yet a priori base of the Lacanian libidinal economy, a crucial impetus necessary for propelling the neonate into the combined arms of imaginary and symbolic others. Only thereby, thanks to helpless neediness as a natural condition of possibility, is the transition to the complex dialectical mediations of demand and desire prompted. Even though imaginary symbolic imprinting and overriding partially denaturalizes need, Lacan's talk of quote-unquote denaturalization automatically implies the prior existence of certain natural things as origins or grounds. The resulting denaturalized subjectivity remains, to phrase this in a Lacanian style, not without a rapport with nature in the guise of its biomaterial body. Or in alternate phrasing, the never successfully denaturalized subject is stuck perpetually struggling with stubbornly indigestible fragments of an incompletely and unevenly domesticated corporeal. In a companion piece to the present text, I highlight the numerous instances in which Lacan, with however many caveats and qualifications, utilizes the notion of the organic in its biological sense. Therein, I argue that Lacan's references to this notion, these cluster around his recurrent embellishments on the mirror stage, Lacan's references to this notion suggest the concept of a non-organicity that would be different from the merely inorganic as dealt with by the physics and chemistry of the non-living. On the basis of this reading of Lacan, I hence distinguish between the inorganic and the quote-unquote anorganic, with the latter being a Hegelian-type negation of the organic as itself, according to Hegel's philosophy of nature, a negation als Aufhebung of the inorganic, that is a dialectical speculative negation of negation, disobeying the rule of double negation in classical bivalent logic. In terms of the Hegelian Realphilosophie of Natur und Geist, I would contend that Lacanian anorganicity, in the organic more than the organic itself, as the Lacan of the 11th seminar might put it, Lacanian anorganicity furnishes a link missing between the end of Hegel's philosophy of nature with its organics culminating with the animal organism, and the beginning of his philosophy of mind, with its anthropology, starting with the soul of human nature in its most rudimentary states. Prior to his mature Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, Hegel, in his 1805 to 1806 Jena Realphilosophie, famously describes humans as, quote-unquote, the night of the world. After passing through a delineation of the organic and the anorganic a la Lacan, a delineation I skip over this evening, I will circumnavigate back to these claims by showing how anorganicity, as a more than organic transcendence, nonetheless immanent to the organic, simultaneously conjoins and disjoins the natural kingdoms of animal organisms and the spiritual/minded regions of human subjects. If the latter are the night of the world, unnatural perversions of nature, the darkness of this negativity is made possible by a pre- or non-human night of the living world internal to inhuman nature itself. That is to say, Hegel's night of the world extends beyond the exclusively human. In terms of an anorganicist insertion of a certain Lacan back into Hegel's Realphilosophie, Lacan himself, in his 1955 écrit Variations on the Standard Treatment, fortuitously hints at this, elaborating on the quote-unquote experiences transpiring in the mirror stage, including those of a kind already described in Hegel's 1807 Phenomenology of Spirit in connection with the master-slave dialectic. He maintains, quote, "But if these experiences, which can be seen in animals too at many moments in their instinctual cycles, and especially in the preliminary displays of the reproductive cycle, with all the lures and aberrations these experiences involve, in fact open onto this signification in order to durably structure the human subject, it is because they receive this signification from the tension stemming from the impotence proper to the prematurity of birth, by which naturalists characterize the specificity of man's anatomical development, a fact that helps us grasp the dehiscence from natural harmony required by Hegel to serve as the fruitful illness, life's happy fault, in which man, distinguishing himself from his essence, discovers his existence," end quote. Characteristically, Lacan does not bother to furnish his readers with specific citations from Hegel's works. But, considering his reliance upon Kojève's version of the phenomenology for his understanding of Hegel, and his explicit mention of the dialectic between master and slave on the very same page of the écrit, Lacan probably is thinking here of the portions of this 1807 text section on self-consciousness preceding the subsection addressing lordship and bondage proper. In the opening pages of this section, Hegel portrays natural desiring life as plagued by monotonous dissatisfactions and futile struggles. That noted, Lacan's choice of the noun quote-unquote impotence serendipitously echoes Hegel's motif of the impotence Ohnmacht of nature. For both authors, a natural clearing is held open for the arising of more than natural transcendences and immanence, thanks to material nature's quote-unquote weakness, Hegel, and quote-unquote rottenness, Lacan in Seminar 24. At the end of the above 1955 quotation, Lacan's allusion to Sartrean existentialism, itself influenced by the Kojèvian Hegel, indicates that from a Lacanian perspective, there indeed is an essence that precedes existence, to contradict Sartre. But this essential nature is not all that natural in any standard naturalist or positivist senses, the senses Sartre presumes as regards talk of essences in conjunction with the natural sciences. In fact, it is pervaded by negativities both materially real and experientially palpable, hence driving the initially biological being beyond a biology it finds unbearable. Despite my solidarity with the facets of Lacan's thinking I have unpacked guided by the idea of the anorganic, I consider his accounts of the emergences of ego and subject to suffer from a major shortcoming. They're exclusively ontogenetic status. As I illustrate and criticize on another occasion, Lacan, inconsistently wavering between epistemological and ontological justifications, strictly prohibits phylogenetic hypotheses and investigations as illegitimate and out of bounds, at least within the limits of psychoanalysis proper as he conceives it. In my critique of Lacan's forbidding of inquiries into phylogeny, I point out how this highly contentious circumscription of the scope of analytic thought leads Lacan into having direct recourse to biblical and Christian references. More specifically, in line with his ban on raising queries regarding the historical origins of language and connected social structures, He permits himself an affirmation of the statement, "in the beginning was the Word," and overtly portrays the advent of the symbolic order, a creative genesis obfuscated and mystified by the Lacanian law against all things phylogenetic, as the descent of the quote-unquote Holy Spirit down into the world. For any atheist materialist, Lacan included, this should be deeply troubling. Dovetailing with this side of the Lacanianism with which I take issue, Jacques-Alain Miller proclaims that, quote, "nothingness enters reality through language," end quote. Such a thesis does not actually fit Lacan himself overall, especially considering the latter's realist and materialist depictions of negativities manifest in core concepts of his like the body in pieces. However, this stated, Miller's proclamation indeed is able to prop itself up against select sides of Lacan's teachings. What Miller and the version of Lacan he relies on represent is, I contend, a dogma particularly widespread in continental European philosophy and its offshoots, infected as these intellectual traditions have been and still remain with various idealist, romanticist, and negative theological tendencies, both avowed and disavowed. Modifying a turn of phrase from American analytic philosopher Wilfrid Sellars' seminal 1956 essay, Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, I consider the most suitable label for this dogma the myth of the non-given. This myth lurks at the basis of each and every appeal to an unexplained givenness of the non-given, with non-givenness referring here to absence, lack, negativity, and so on. Hence, the myth of the non-given assumes the factical there-ness of nothingness, non-presence, etc. Apropos a theory of subjectivity, its supporting background presence is borne witness to by dogmatic invocations of an irreducible, unanalyzable nothingness as the primordial privative cause of the subject, or even as the subject itself. No matter how seemingly sophisticated and intricate the jargonistic gesticulating, these invocations boil down, when all is said and done, to vulgar foot stamping and fist banging. As regards the myth of the non-given in relation to certain theories of subjectivity, a bond of complicity is established between them at the dawn of Renaissance humanism with its founding document, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's 1486 oration on the dignity of man. Therein, Pico della Mirandola describes human beings, as distinct from all other creatures and creations, as specially endowed by God with a strange, peculiar, natureless nature, an inner absence of form, unlike that to be found anywhere else in the abundant, overflowing fullness of the rest of the formed world. Through top-down divine fiat alone, an abyssal groundlessness of pure negativity becomes the metaphysical spark of humans in their crown of creation dignity. A rock-bottom emptiness of otherworldly provenance is the privative ur-cause of humanity's distinctiveness. Jumping ahead to the past century, ostensibly irreligious minds continue to propagate, without critical modifications, variants of Pico della Mirandola's mythical, theological story of uniquely human voidedness. In the continental Europe of the previous 100 years generally, and in France particularly, atheists and non-atheists, humanists and anti-humanists, and partisans of a range of other apparently incompatible theoretical orientations faithfully reproduce this narrative with differing degrees of self-awareness. Even when decoupled from the Christian framework of on the dignity of man, assertions of an ex nihilo, always already there absence, lack, nothingness, void, etc., at and as the heart of subjectivity, perpetuate the vices of dogmatism, mystification, and obscurantism. Through dependence on the myth of the non-given, those putting forward these assertions either rest on positings of a priori metaphysical unexplained explainers, or capriciously balk at thinking their way through to the underlying foundations of their positions. Lacan and Lacanians, insofar as they staunchly refuse to contemplate the lengthier stretches of human and natural histories anyone with sound scientific sensibilities presumes gave rise to present-day humanity, evince belief in a mythical givenness of negativity as itself non-givenness. Apart from the idealist and anti-naturalist variants of Lacanianism against which I have argued in the past, even on the most sympathetic materialist, quasi-naturalist reading of Lacan, which I try to offer elsewhere, he continues to be guilty of investment in this myth. Within his purely ontogenetic picture, the infant's corps morcelé is referred to as if it were the ultimate there-ness of a ground zero origin incapable of further explanation, say for ahistorical idealist talk about big others as eternally pre-existing, phylogenetically inexplicable symbolic orders into which conception and birth throws children. Severed from its natural connections with phylogenetic and evolutionary histories, the prematurationally helpless body and pieces of ontogeny darkens into being an opaque bedrock of false fictional absoluteness. The myth of the non-given hides itself poorly in the cracks and gaps of this barred corporeal. If these specters of negativities are not to be exorcised completely after being flushed out of the nooks and crannies within bodies, what is to be done with them? How are they to be rightly situated? To be crystal clear, I do not intend to repudiate Lacan's rich dissections of embodiment. Instead, I merely aim to demonstrate that his reflections on these matters are indefensibly incomplete and in need of substantial supplementary supports of sorts with which he likely would not be comfortable, about which I will say more shortly. Other figures capable of providing philosophical refuge and cover for a mysticism of negativity are not hard to identify. Apart from Lacan, his existentialist contemporaries Heidegger, with his unfathomable ascendings and ecstatic clearings of being as no thing, and Sartre, with his unnaturally essenceless existences, are obvious examples. As an aside, I do not consider Hegel and Marx, despite possible appearances to the contrary, guilty of repeating or resting upon appeals to mystical negativities in the manners I'm objecting to in this setting. Flashing forward to today, Alain Badiou and Giorgio Agamben are two living philosophers influenced by these predecessors, and under such influences, embellishing upon the myth of the non-given. Agamben's human being is a quote-unquote man without content, a de-essentialized openness, as first glimpsed by Pico della Mirandola, to whom Agamben waves, a de-essentialized openness whose always second quote-unquote nature is continually subjected to ongoing constructions and reconstructions, putting to work its unworkable, inexhaustible potentialities. Similarly, Badiou's human being is a quote-unquote voided animal, to be thought by a new quote-unquote inhumanism, combining Sartre's humanism and the anti-humanism of Lacan, Althusser, and Foucault. Badiou equally praises these four French forerunners of his for their unflinching opposition to, quote-unquote, a bad Darwin, although he has yet to indicate whether for him there is such a thing as a good Darwin, and if so, what he would look like and what relevance, if any, he would have for Badiouian philosophy. In short, unlike all other animals, Badiou's voided animal cannot be addressed by naturalism, purportedly calling instead for anti-naturalist, one might be tempted to say supernaturalist, engagements. The surfacing of Darwin's name at this juncture is fortuitous and fitting. Apart from Kant and Hegel as its twin fountainheads, the vast bulk of what has come to be known as continental philosophy springs from the unholy trinity of Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. In my estimation, the almost blanket neglect of Darwin by these philosophical orientations, leveraged to the authority of this triumvirate of his approximate contemporaries, is symptomatic of a swarm of intellectual and ideological problems plaguing various strains of continental philosophy and its permutations. Ironically, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, unlike so many of their self-proclaimed successors, do not downplay or ignore Darwin's immense significance. Whereas the majority of continental philosophers of the past century underestimate the far-reaching radicality of the Darwinian revolution, a sizable number of analytic philosophers tend to the opposite extreme of overestimating it. Along with Hegel, the figure of Darwin marks a fork of fundamental divergence between the continental and analytic traditions, broadly speaking. Although I have reservations about hyperbole and Daniel Dennett's trumpeting of Darwinian evolutionary theory as a quote-unquote universal acid, I readily acknowledge the incredible potency and magnitude of the Darwin event, to employ Badiou's language in a fashion he himself probably would not. My wager is that dispelling the myth of the non-given, while nonetheless preserving its insistence on an intimate rapport between subjectivity and negativity, as should be obvious by now, my antipathy toward mystical varieties of Lacks by no means entails my sympathy toward Lack-denying positivisms, organicisms, or anything else in these scientistic veins. This demands evolutionary phylogenetic explanations of the natural emergences of the denaturalized, more than natural negativities inherent to real subjects qua subjectivity proper, that is, as irreducible to garden variety pseudoscientific naturalisms. For any philosophical or psychoanalytic system reconciled with the natural sciences and allied with historical and dialectical materialisms, a rapprochement with Darwin's ideas is requisite. With respect to the Lacan discussed earlier in this intervention, a non-mystical, thoroughly materialist account of the historical genesis of the ontogenetic ground zero of the biomaterial body in pieces needs the help of Darwin and his evolutionary theoretic heirs. Without accepting such assistance, Lacanianism leaves itself divided from within by an unsustainable self-contradiction in which it is split between ontogenetic atheism and phylogenetic theism. On this matter, a choice formally configured as a Badiouian point, that is, a decision between two irreconcilable alternatives with no third way available, thrusts itself forward. In the terms of heavy-handed American bumper sticker sloganeering, this is a choice between the Jesus fish and the Darwin amphibian. Also related to the concocted controversies surrounding evolution in America's culture wars, neuroscientist David Linden lays out an elegantly simple and utterly devastating argument against anti-Darwinian proponents of so-called intelligent design. In his 2007 book, The Accidental Mind, How Brain Evolution Has Given Us Love, Memory, Dreams, and God, he represents the human central nervous system as a quote-unquote kludge. Quote, "The brain is a kludge, a design that is inefficient, inelegant, and unfathomable, but that nevertheless works," end quote. Linden stresses that the human brain is, in fact, unintelligently designed, insofar as it is the contingent byproduct of countless uncoordinated evolutionary accidents in which, again and again, the relatively newer is tossed into an intricate but sloppy mix with the comparatively older. Hence, this organ of organs is quote-unquote poorly organized, a quote-unquote cobbled together mess. Aficionados of American television can think of this as the MacGyver picture of the brain. The human central nervous system would have to be Exhibit A for those of America's culture warriors who still to this day desire to re-prosecute the 1925 Scopes trial. As is common knowledge, the anti-evolution advocates of intelligent design rest their case on the move of emphasizing the complexity of organic beings and maintaining that such complexity is inexplicable on the basis of the blind, random mechanisms proposed by Darwinian models of evolutionary processes. They believe Darwin and his followers to be fatally unable to answer questions as to how highly functional and seamlessly organized organisms could arise from the unguided chaos of a physical universe of contingencies without teleologies. The human brain, if anything, would be the pinnacle of such stunning sophistication in the natural world. Its networked assemblies of astronomical numbers of neurons and synapses come together to generate and sustain seemingly miraculous mindedness and everything this brings with it. Linden's concise neuroscientific refutation of intelligent design consists of an additional move beyond just establishing the anorganic kludginess of the anatomy and physiology of the central nervous system. This by itself already would be enough, since a demonstrable lack of the organicist features of functionality, organization, and so on is sufficient to cast reasonable doubts on the claim that an intelligent designer intentionally built a marvelously elaborate and synchronized material seat suited for his human subjects. The further step Linden takes in driving home his critique is to assert, on the basis of ample supporting evidence, that the brain is endowed with its wondrous mind-making powers, celebrated by proponents and critics of evolution alike, specifically by virtue of its kludginess, resulting from an absence of intelligent design. In Linden's hands, the kludge model of the central nervous system, this is equivalent to, in my terms, an anorganic barring of the corporeal, of the brain in particular. This model elevates the deficit of overarching harmony or synthesis therein to the ontological status of a privative cause at the level of biomaterial being in and of itself. This perspicuous line of thought transforms the example of the human brain into a Trojan horse in relation to advocates of intelligent design. Linden turns the star piece of evidence appealed to in their case into the very thing refuting it most decisively. Furthermore, Linden's argument subtly hints at an implication of even greater import. The absence of God is the ultimate negative ur-cause in a physical universe internally producing and containing human beings and their subjectivities. The key principle behind anorganicity, with kludginess being one of its manifestations, can be stated through an inversion of a cliché. More is less, rather than, as the saying goes, less is more. For instance, the kludgy corps morcelé, shot through and permeated with antagonisms, conflicts, deficiencies, fissures, gaps, splits, and the like, is not a materialization of the factical givenness of a mysterious void. The myth of the non-given, with its mystical, metaphysical version of negativity, proceeds on the basis of a less is more logic, with the less of a primal nothingness giving rise to the more of really existing subjects. By contrast, my anorganic approach, substituting for this type of myth a non-mystical physical version of negativity, proceeds on the basis of a more is less logic, with the more of a contingent, non-teleological accumulation of material bits and pieces, giving rise to the less of discrepancies and discordances within and between these fragments. As per the more is less principle of the anorganic, surpluses of positivity, as unplanned, uncoordinated agglomerations of mute idiotic entities and events, dialectically tip over into deficits of negativity. Put in terms familiar to government bureaucrats, computer programmers, and tax lawyers, with the increasing complexity of organic systems, as with all systems, such as political institutions, software codes, and bodies of laws, with the increasing complexity of organic systems comes a proportional increase in the number of bugs and loopholes imminently generated within and through systemic complexity itself. In Lacanian parlance, both symbolic and real systems can and do succumb to self-barring. Lacan's crucial concept of the body in pieces and other ideas of his related to this concept, once plugged into the theoretical framework of transcendental materialism and its anorganicism, go from being dogmatically asserted givens always already there out of thin air to becoming psychoanalytic and philosophical touchstones anchored in solid science-consistent materialist thinking. Likewise, as regards the threshold between philosophy of nature and philosophy of mind in the more than logical real philosophy of Hegel's Encyclopedia, the dialectical dynamics of anorganicism permit speculating that the movement from animal to human organisms transpires when growth in the natural complexity of the animal organism crosses a certain tipping point. Past this point, animal anorganicism, qua harmonious organization, short-circuits itself in acquiring a critical mass of inner incompatibilities between its parts, thereby igniting the bursting forth of anorganic structures and phenomena. The more of animal complexity leads to the less of the negativities lying at the base of human being qua minded spiritual humanity. The plus of positive natural additions transitions to the minus of denaturalizing subtractions. The French biologist and Nobel laureate Jacques Monod, in his 1970 book Chance and Necessity, an essay on the natural philosophy of modern biology, provides an indispensable refutation of an all too widespread misconstrual of evolution in biology. Therein, he incisively observes that, quote, evolution is not a property of living beings, since it stems from the very imperfections of the conservative mechanism which indeed constitutes their unique privilege, end quote. In other words, evolution does not unfold as a smooth, continuous succession of fluid flowerings in which unbroken sequences of clockwork living spheres blossom out of one another with placid, balanced beauty, as imagined in the fantasies of organicist holism. Instead, evolutionary changes happen if and when any number of things go terribly wrong for organisms in relation to their bottom-line strivings to perpetuate themselves as individuals and species, as in genetic mutations, environmental catastrophes, and so on. Instances on the scale of phylogeny of what Lacan, citing Hegel, calls, quote, the fruitful illness, life's happy fault, end quote, on the scale of ontogeny. Hence, Monod justifiably concludes that evolution is antithetic to life, insofar as occurrences of evolution are moments when life as it is gets traumatically disorganized and truncated. He also later states that, quote, the accelerating pace of cultural evolution was to split completely away from that of the genome, end quote. However, the anti-natural revolution of the imminent material genesis of, in Hegelian locution, Geist out of Natur, is nevertheless a trajectory internal to evolution in Monod's broadened sense. What is more, a precise parallel can be drawn between Hegel's treatment of war as a spiritual event with Monod's treatment of evolution as a natural event. For Hegel, periods of pleasing tranquility are historical, quote-unquote, blank pages of socio-cultural stagnation, punctuated by bracing make-or-break episodes of disruption in the form of violent conflagrations. For Monod, evolution is to life what war is to peace for Hegel. If human beings are animal organisms sick unto death, this fateful derailment of the natural into the more than natural occurs by virtue of the real dialectical dynamics of the anorganic as a self-induced sickening of nature itself, a nature already weak and rotten on its own, prior to its further decompleting of itself through belching out humanity. Avatars of the myth of the non-given instantiate the gesture of adding a supernatural nothing so as to explain away this enigmatic denaturalized transcendence that is nonetheless puzzlingly immanent to the natural world. An advocate of transcendental materialist anorganicism risks the step of subtracting from the natural world what these worshippers of a mystical negativity presumptively attribute to it, such that they then feel compelled to have faith in a rigid, brittle anti-naturalism threatened by the advances of the natural sciences. Interfacing the anorganic logic of the more is less principle with the life sciences and evolutionary theory is the key to a material rather than mystical negativity. This key opens the door to an ontological vision of human subjects as entirely contained within, but not fully constrained by, the lone physical universe within which they arise. Thank you.
Slavoj Žižek.
Okay. First, as both of my colleagues already said, I also would like to give my sincere thanks to all of you who are here, to Claire, Todd, and to Stanley. I hope you saw that shitty film. I didn't like it. I Am Legend. Very reactionary third version. I think you are one of the few guys on Manhattan who has the right to say, at least for us leftists, I am legend. So I like much more than that. Let me begin with, because we are at the level of this crucial debate, what is materialism today, although I think that Lenin's Materialism and Empirical Criticism is one of the worst books of all times. But he was right when he said, with every new scientific discovery and so on, materialism has to be reinvented. And I think this task awaits us. Because, just to give you a hint where I want to move, did you notice a very strange thing? Till, I would say, very approximately, it doesn't matter, 1920s, idealism or spiritualism versus materialism was infinite versus finite. You know, throughout 19th century, materialists were saying, we are just bodies, limited. Idealists were saying, no, we have an eternal soul, infinite above. But did you notice how, somewhere, I would say, from Sein und Zeit, Heidegger's on, but maybe, just maybe, I don't have time to go into it, although I would love to, in a much more subtle way, from Kant already, the finitude, in the sense of us being constrained, irreducibly embodied to our bodily existence, far from limiting us from the contact to the suprasensible, however we body, becomes the very space which opens up, sustains our contact with another dimension. You know how the story goes, the typical so-called, yes, and I have a Goebbels reaction, I draw my gun when I hear this word, post-secular thought. How do they go? They say, no, of course, God doesn't exist as the highest entity, but, as they say, we are constrained to our irreducible finitude, which means we will never be masters of life. We are limited when we think to the edge, we encounter the void. And then take your path. One is in that void, not God as the highest entity, but the void itself calls us as ethical address in Levinas, and so on and so on. And if you don't believe me, just think about a strange fact. One of the top, I admit it, cinema directors, Andrei Tarkovsky, the Russian. Did you notice how he's at the same time the ultimate, maybe not New Age, but nonetheless spiritualist, and the ultimate director of immersion into Earth? You remember those legendary shots from Stalker and so on? A typically Tarkovskian spiritual experience is not up, but literally, you even put your head into mud, into water, there is the spirit. And maybe you will not agree with me. My solution here is a crazy and radical one. Yes, bodily materiality, with all that bullshit, life world, what Marxists who like early Marx, the worst one for me, like, bodily concrete existence, not abstract scientific materialism, but the way we are embedded in concrete context. This is idealism today, and notions like eternity, immortality, abstract disembodied reason, this is what we should accept. I'm for total turning around here. Let's not be, the way to be really materialist today means to accept a much more abstract level of matter, where, now I will be very spiritually aggressive, I'm tired of materialists who think, like in Tarkovsky's films, know that to be a materialist, you must get dirty and put your head into mud or whatever, Now, okay. Let me begin how I would like to complicate things, because I would like to begin with a question to you, which is a rhetorical question. I don't allow you to answer it now. Which is, you used a couple of times the term transcendental materialism. I agree, but did you get it? I didn't. What the fuck did you exactly mean by it? Answer prohibited.
Yes.
You do afterwards. Let me see where I see the problem. I would like to begin, and you, Martin, also began with it, I agree, with a certain critical distance towards Heidegger. Okay, we all know, among other things, conditions of possibility is a formula of transcendental approach. When you see a thing, you should step back in a reflexive way and not be fetishistically fascinated, but ask what horizon should be here that we perceive the thing, like blah, blah, blah. Okay, I claim Heidegger is the ultimate transcendental philosopher. I know he would reject this claim, but by transcendental philosopher, I mean simply this. Of course, radically historicized transcendental philosopher. Germans have this wonderful word, unhintergehbar. You cannot step behind the ultimate horizon. And for Heidegger, what I call nonetheless, a transcendental disclosure of being, the way things, the horizon of meaning, within, in each historical epoch differently, things appear to us is unhintergehbar. You cannot step behind. What Heidegger calls Ereignis, here I agree with Heideggerians, is not some higher entity, God up there who pulls the string. Now being is disclosed to you as absolute Hegelian subject, then God says, enough of this, now full technology or whatever. No, it's just Ilya, es gibt, a totally impersonal spiel, transcendental game. It's not the name of a, here those stupid critics who think Ereignis or Zionist, Heidegger's name for God, are wrong. I see, so which problem do I see here? First, this approach, and for example, you know how you recognize this approach in Heidegger? As a rule, he likes to emphasize whenever, this is almost one of Heidegger's, which can be even computer-generated, in the sense that I always like to think about Heidegger as the ultimate philosopher of technology, in the sense that sometimes his formulas are so predictable that you can imagine, ask me what is the essence of anything, And Heidegger would answer the essence of lightness is the lightness of the essence itself. In my book on Kieslowski, I went to the end, moment of obscenity, and wrote, a Heideggerian would, he likes to say the essence of technology is nothing technological, no? That the essence of fucking is nothing about fuck. It's the being fucked up, verborgen, of the essence itself. It's absolutely correct. But let me be very serious here. One tendency of Heidegger here, you can recognize is it, to move towards, let's call it naively, indifference, irrelevance of the ontic. Heidegger's answer to, for example, Holocaust. This is not to mock Holocaust, but the ultimate horror, would have been horrible as it is, but the true catastrophe is not Holocaust. The true catastrophe is the Gestell and framing technological enclosure of mind which enabled industrial production of corpses that we call Holocaust. Or even Heidegger says this directly. Let's say we will all die with atomic explosion, war. Heidegger said already in the late 50s, when we had that scare, no, the true danger is not the danger of self-destruction. The true catastrophe already occurred. The moment we adopted the disclosure of being as something at our disposal for technological exploitation and so on and so on. What's my problem here? First, it's a too easy way. I don't agree with it. The standard way is to claim that Heidegger plays this game to cover up the traces of his catastrophic ontic engagement. Like if you tell him you were a Nazi, he will say, oh, Nazis, communists, liberals, metaphysically they are all the same, it doesn't matter. You know, this is why on the very day of the capitulation of Germany, with obvious pleasure, Heidegger wrote in one of his, I don't know which texts I remember, on that day he said, don't we see, nothing was decided with this, ontologically unimportant that Hitler lost and so on. This is too simple. I have another, and here I approach your topic, totally naive problem with Heidegger here. Namely, and first it will appear naive, then I will tell you it returns from late 1920s, already even there are traces in Zeinun Zeit, up till some of his last, I wouldn't say texts, seminars like his seminar on Heraclitus with Eugen Fink. This very naive problem. Okay, what is Unhintergehbares? What we go behind? Because Heidegger's reply, I don't agree with him, to you, for example, would have been, okay, Darwinism, blah, blah. But isn't it that as a Darwinist, you already approach nature with a certain a priori horizon of understanding. Nature is something, evolution, which can be described through a scientific way. And you know, this horizon is already here. The problem I see is extremely naive. And you find touching moments, some of them were pointed out by in his seminar on the animal, lectures by Heidegger, which I think is one of the most beautiful, Derrida, one of the most beautiful Derrida texts, namely, Heidegger is not an idiot. He knows very well that disclosure of being, the event of certain epochal disclosure of being, is not ontic creation. That's crucial, no? Heidegger doesn't say Ereignis creates entities. Yes, but fuck you, what does this mean? And Heidegger asks the obvious question. First quote, from 2930, a letter from that period. I often ask myself, that has for a long time been a fundamental question for me. What nature would be without man? Must it not resonate through him in order to attain its own potency? You notice how Heidegger here, the question he raises, clearly oversteps the transcendental horizon of how nature is disclosed. Heidegger directly asks, but how is nature precisely, to put it very brutally and naively, outside Ereignis? If you don't believe this, even in Zeinun Zeit, with all that ontology, he says at some point, of course, things exist independent, no, not exist, that's the point. Things are out there independently of Dasein, even Sein, but they don't exist in the ecstatic sense that you, Martin, disclosed, no? They are, not even are, just out there. They don't exist. So it's interesting how Heidegger, who is supposed to be the philosopher who returned or reaffirmed the ontological approach, admits his impossibility, blindness to go in this direction. And I would here say that it's maybe paradoxical that the same ambiguity that you, Adrian, detected in Lacan, I agree with you there, you find it even with Heidegger. You know, in his seminar on fundamental concepts of metaphysics, one of the most interesting ones, I think 2930, you know, that famous definition, Derrida has a wonderful detailed analysis of it as objects, dead objects, whatever this means, in the world, like a stone, are weltlos, without world. An animal is weltarm, poor in the world. We humans are beings in the world, a world in the sense of horizon of disclosure of being, is a world opens up to us. Now, of course, the obvious question to Heidegger here would have been, is it not that the moment you call an animal as weltarm, by what do you measure the animal? By humans who are fully in the world. So, what does this mean? Now, the standard transcendental answer would have been, you are asking a traditional metaphysical, phylogenetic, whatever question. The fact is that we as human beings are irreducibly within the world. We cannot step on our head and ask how animals are, how whatever is outside the horizon of being. So, of course, he would say animals are weltarm with comparison to us. But we cannot think outside this, because being, it's not anthropocentrism because it's being, Ereignis, but being discloses itself only through Dasein, being there. But, you know, this is not all. For example, and again, here we have, here and there, this topic which moves to a totally different terrain, which, and you, Martin, who probably knows much more about Heidegger than me, I wonder how you would react to this. Namely, to a terrain which I think moves to much more to a, although this is maybe not the right term, here I concede, to something like typical German romantic tradition, shailing some mystics, the tradition of so-called, and Heidegger refers to it, sorrow in nature. Benjamin takes over this tradition when he says nature is mute suffering. It's terrible suffering which cannot articulate itself, and the fact that we humans started to speak, it's not just us. Nature arrived to a word to release its pain through us. A quote, again, from the same Heidegger seminar, 2930. If deprivation in certain forms is a kind of suffering, and poverty and deprivation of world belongs to the animal's being, then a kind of pain and suffering would have to permeate the whole animal realm and the realm of life in general. You see, this is no longer the claim we are always already in transcendental horizon. This is a claim that, to put it very naively, there is a certain pain, poverty, deprivation already in nature itself. Or another quote, it is in the hope of requiting the great sorrow of nature, of redemption from that suffering, that humans live and speak in nature. So I claim that Heidegger, the way I see it, that this remains a kind of a shadowy undertone, but I don't see Heidegger really resolving or even fully confronting this deadlock. And I agree with both of you, here our analysis should begin. My solution, I wonder it's the same as yours, would have been, first, I totally agree with you, Adrian, that all that poetry of negativity, it's even worse in Lacan, you know, like Lacan totally without question accepts certain definitions, like even some of them which seem sympathetic to me. For example, animals can cheat, but they cannot cheat to cheat. They cannot lie in the guise of truth. You know when? I suspect you to me, you know that famous, why are you telling me you're going to Krakow when you are really going to Krakow? You know? Or the truth immortalized the logic in the in Marx's Night in the Opera, you know that all the time quoted Groucho Marx defending a client in a courtroom. You know, this guy looks as an idiot, talks as an idiot, this shouldn't deceive you, this guy is an idiot. You know, like that this type of cheating you don't find in. So, and not to mention what you said, like always this bad nature, not bad, nature which is stupid, circular, whatever, And then, even if you apparently denigrate man, like, the man is the illness of nature, nature gone crazy, whatever, somehow, as you said, this opening void. Yeah, but where I find here this solution? And incidentally, Lacan, it's not as simple as you. I think that he oscillates between two extremes, like Heidegger. On the one hand, you have this shitty poetry of the big other. We are stupid human animals, we want to eat, to screw whatever you want, and then, oh my God, the big other. And then you have all this terminology of colonization. The big other is like a foreign parasite who colonizes, derails human being, and so on. But at the same time, especially in late Lacan, you find the opposite story, which is, for me, more sympathetic, that something went terribly wrong in nature itself. Some excess, not a big theological thing, simply some catastrophe. And then language, far from being something denaturalized, is rather an attempt to restore some kind of balance. It's exactly the opposite theory. Language is not that intruder who destabilizes us. It's precisely an attempt to find stability, and so on and so on. So again, here, my solution is a little bit different one, maybe. I agree with you, but his notion of the human animal, who is then disturbed from time to time by the event. The problem is, but here comes the catch, would you agree with it or not? The problem for me is not the way the Badiou is usually criticized. No, like we are all human animals, and then from nowhere, no one knows where another, basically idealist, whatever divine side, the call to the event comes. I claim Badiou's basic myth is the human animal itself. His description of the non-evental human being is this simple utilitarian human. We are utilitarians, we just want pleasures and so on. If there is any meaning in Freud, it's that we humans are not human animals, in the sense that, the distortion is already in our nature. So, my God, I don't want to eat time of the others, at least not more than you, so I will condense it now. My solution would have been, just to hint at which one, not just naturalize all this transcendental dimension, but denaturalize nature itself. The true question is, how are we to think nature, or whatever it was, so that something like this human disclosure event is possible? And here I find the interest, although I'm amateur in them, in things like quantum physics and so on. I think, and of course, don't misunderstand me. I become Goebbels and draw my gun when somebody says, oh, quantum physics, our mind creates reality and all that bullshit. No, it's the most materialist theory that you can imagine, but difficult to think. So I would say first, how we have to change the concept of the concept of nature itself. And here, when you put Marx into the line of those who are not these bad poets of mystical negativity, but it's nonetheless, I agree with Robert Pippin, the great American Hegelian, bourgeois liberal, but nonetheless, who nonetheless made a nice remark that the young Marx, in his assertion of positivity of concrete human being, becomes too Aristotelian. He wants to avoid this theological negativity, but this is why I hate that young Marx of, asserting life powers. It's Aristotelianism. We have a certain basic positive passions and so on. It's not radical enough. This is just my problem here. And I here remind, although I don't totally follow Derrida, but what I like in Derrida, I agree with all of you that the problem is how to go beyond the transcendental without, to be cynical as a joke, without becoming Quentin Meillassoux, no, as I put it, not to say, without this new realism. Incidentally, they are not the worst. I hate much more so-called new materialism, those, I will not go into that. But okay, and I think that I'm tempted to say it's not direct naturalism. I'm more sympathetic, although I wouldn't follow him concretely, into what Derrida tries to do. This idea of a, how should I call it, of pushing transcendental reflection beyond itself, not of directly supplementing transcendental reflection with some materialist foundation. It's a very complex topic, so let me stop now. The second point, and here I wonder if you would agree. I'm now jumping to the second point, conditions of possibility. Maybe I don't understand it in the Derridian sense, but I like this idea of conditions of possibility are simultaneously conditions of impossibility. Derrida likes to say that often. I explain this, I understand this in the sense of, for me, one of the most radical theses of Hegel in his at the beginning of part 2 of Logic of Essence, Logic of Reflection, where Hegel introduces a unique category, I love it, absoluter Gegenstoß, counterpunch, counterthrust, or simply, yes, counterpunch, counterpush. The idea is what? It is, I think Hegel does here what Derrida wants to do and sometimes claims Hegel cannot do it, but quite often he admits Hegel can do it. Derrida is, did you notice this? Derrida was not an idiot. He's very ambiguous with regard to Hegel. Remember always, when Derrida was once asked, but which of the philosophers in all metaphysical tradition is closest to difference? Fuck it, he said Hegel, So, again, here is the quote. Listen to it, wonderful. And now I come, the concluding part, to politics, don't be afraid, it's a difficult quote, but life is difficult shit, so you have to suffer it. No. Reflection, therefore, finds before it an immediate which it transcends and from which it is the return. But this return is only the presupposing of what reflection finds before it. What is thus found, listen to beauty, what is thus found only comes to be through being left behind. This reflective moment is to be taken as an absolute recoil, Gegenstoß, upon itself. For the presupposition of the return into self is only in the return itself. What Hegel says here is, I claim, wonderful. It's that the process, and I think you can detect here also a temporal dimension, is that where effectively the present loses its primacy. It's a process where something is lost but doesn't pre-exist the loss. It's something, even in theological terms you can say this, that, and Hegel reads like this the Bible, there is fall. But what is this, the fall from? Not from paradise. Hegel says paradise is animal kingdom, stupid animals, no? The fall is fall from goodness. Yes, but goodness is opened up when you fall, you see, fall itself constitutes what it is the fall from. And let me give you now, first, very problematic, consciously politics, an example which I proposed in India, and typically those Brahmin cultural critics didn't like it. The untouchables, my true friends there, like this example. So, class struggle in theory. I was there at some meeting when all these Brahmin cultural critics, who are they? They are the guys who, if you mention equality, they say, don't force upon us those imperialist notions. When you say, why don't you abolish castes? They say, no, you want to erase our unique cultural identity and so on. So these guys said something like that. They complained that the fact that they are compelled to use English language in their theory is already a form of cultural colonialism, censoring their true identity. Their argument was something like this. We have to speak in an imposed foreign language to express our innermost identity. So even our resistance to our colonization has to be formulated in the language of the colonized. Here I would apply that Hegel. That is to say, yes, the English language is imposed on them, and this makes us feel like, we are alienated from our... But the dimension that they feel deprived of emerged only through this imposition of English language. What really was before was not any bullshit of true Indian identity. It was just that bunch of confused traditions and so on. You know who knew this? Let me give you another example that I like. Malcolm X. No, I'm really for him, not just out of some stupid, patronizing, secretly racist respect. He explained very beautifully X. Why Malcolm X? He said, cut the bullshit about African roots. The enslavement made us an X, and we should be faithful to this X and find freedom precisely in this lack of roots. Cut the bullshit of returning to African roots, and so on and so on. So you see, we get here a different image of Hegelian dialectical process. It's no longer simply we have some immediate fullness which alienates itself and gets back. No, we have, of course, something is before. But this is simply a kind of inconsistent plurality, and then you fall, but this fall itself creates the other dimension from which you fall. Slowly to the end. First, my third moment, what I would like also to emphasize is how, and here I agree with Badiou, how the conditions of possibility are precisely something which cannot be used to adequately describe what even Derrida uses sometimes the term encounter or act or the new. The best formal definition for me of radically, historically new phenomenon, revolutionary and so on, is precisely, and different philosophers put this very nicely, something which appears till it happens as impossible, and then once it happens, it retroactively creates its conditions of possibility. Now you will say, I'm bullshitting postmodern games. No, I will refer to most immediate metaphysic, sentimental experience you may have. You fall in love. But you cannot say, I have fallen in love because of this and that and that. If you do this, I claim it's not true love. It's mental accountancy, like there are, I don't want to be a sexist, there are 3 girls here, one has beautiful legs, the other breasts and eyes, the third one I don't know what, and I make you know. Legs, this has 3 to 1, she wins, I fall in love. No, love is like religion here. You know, true theological statement is, if you become religious because you were convinced by the arguments for this religion, this is a blasphemy. Now you will say, this is religious bullshit. I'm sorry to tell you, Marx says exactly the same thing. When he says that Marxism is not an objective theory. Leftists, we are not like, you study history, you see, hey, there is a tendency workers will win, so let's jump onto the winning horse, you know. No, you must be, there are arguments for, but you must be engaged to see the powers of these arguments. And isn't it that true acts, political even, always have this magical aspect, like even a well-known ordinary one like Tahrir Square. My God, who expected that? All of a sudden it was possible. And of course, all reactionary liberal sociologists are trying to convince us that it wasn't really an event. It was just, you know, in Egypt, confused, frustrated, educated people. It's to de-eventalize it. My last 2-3 minutes, if you just allow me, example here will be a very sad one. But here I see a use of the term conditions of possibility. And here we have a kind of a materialist transcendental approach. You know, true critical mind does what? When you encounter something terrifying, and we live in such times, unfortunately. By terrifying, I don't mean anything moralistic. At least now I talk about Europe. I don't want to practice the eternal America bashing. In Europe, we are more and more losing reasons to be arrogant towards. You know what's so horrible in Europe? Things which were simply unimaginable to be taken seriously in the public, like anti-immigrant topic. You know, 20 years ago, you didn't talk like this in public. are now acceptable. People simply don't notice it, how problematic it is. And this is the saddest thing, that even the so-called left social democrats often accept this. In the same way as Margaret Thatcher said something very true. I'm not a Thatcherite. She was asked recently, what do you think is your greatest achievement? And she said, New Labour. In the sense of, even the enemy adopted my basic economic approach. But you know that Jean-Marie Le Pen said the same. When he lost some elections years ago, he said, that's my victory. I lost because all other parties accepted the topic. They said, okay, Le Pen does it in a wild way, barbaric, but there is a problem of immigrants threatening, blah, blah. So if you just allow me quickly to conclude, I want to tell you, I repeat this, I hope you didn't already hear them, 2 examples of things where really we should ask this transcendental question. Not be fascinated by the horror, but what is changing in our, what Hegel would have called sittliche Substanz, in our ethical collective substance, that such things are possible. First is a wonderful documentary, Act of Killing, by Joshua Oppenheimer. It's a story about an Indonesian gang who were doing massive killings in 1966 or when Suharto took over. 2 million Chinese, mostly pretended to be communists, were killed. These guys shot a movie and went into public. And what is so terrifying is that they don't even respect this minimal Nazi constraint of, like, let's do it discreetly, kill the Jews or whatever. In this film, you should see it when it will be released, documentary, for example, you have a scene, it's like real, it's impossible happens. You have to see it to believe it. The film shows a public TV show debate in some, I forgot which one, yes, Medan, a big city in Indonesia, where in front of a public live transmission on a big, not marginal TV station, and there is a nice young woman, a moderator, who asked one of them, Anwar Congo is his name of this guy, can you please tell us how did you discover the most efficient way to rape women? And then she goes on. Yes, we made experiments and we discovered that one practical way is that you bring her husband on sun and threaten to cut off his balls if she doesn't, or that you put a wire around her face and you hold her. It's nightmare. And then the moderator, I couldn't believe it, says, oh my God, a big round of applause for Mr. Congo's creative approach, and so on and so on. You just don't. This is the naive question, Don't moralize, and I don't blame the Indonesians, I'm not saying they are barbarians. No, I claim it's a certain ethical disintegration as the result of global capitalism. My last example, in a way even saddest, and with this I really conclude, in Nanjing, a couple of years ago, happened something unthinkable, to me at least. An old lady descended from local bus and fell down, breaking her hip. A young guy standing on the bus behind her, who was minimally decent, sympathized with her and also stepped down, although it wasn't his stop, helped her to stand up when he saw that she broke her hip. He took her to the hospital, even gave her some money, and so on. 2 weeks later, he got a letter from police. The woman was prosecuting him, claiming that he must have helped him because he was guilty of pushing her down. And now comes the horror. I will try if I will find it. This is the horror. The court gave her right. The guy went 2 months to prison and had to pay with following argumentation. According to common sense, Peng Yu, that's the guy's name, had to knock over the woman because no normal person would be as kind as Peng Yu claimed he was. And yes, the guy got to, but Now things here are more, now let's not moralize. I'm not saying Chinese are like this or capitalism. You know, if you ask about conditions of possibility, you discover something much deeper. A friend of mine from China told me this. Did you notice how in our global capitalist market society, the very line between what is public and private is shifting? Even places which appeared public, if we are not directly connected, more and more function like private places where you are not responsible for what you see. Because typically, many young people in China, when they were asked how they would react, like if they were to see an old woman or man dying, they're wounded, 87% said, I would ignore it. But then when asked why, they specified. They said, I would quickly look around. If there is their CCTV camera, then I would help him or her, otherwise not. I would like to really conclude with an obscenity, that's my nature, link this to another phenomenon. It may sound more attractive, but it's even more depressive. My friend, I don't do such things, told me that the latest fashion in hardcore pornography is so-called public sex. And very strange phenomenon, most popular it is in Hungary, Poland, and post-communist countries. And, well, you can check it up, go to TNA Flicks. But know what's so shocking? Recently, I admit it. I wanted to check it. I saw one. I opened, and yes, I am now paying the price. Every day I got 5 messages like, guaranteed in 2 weeks, 3 inches longer, you know them, you know. Okay, but what's so terrifying is that you have, for example, a couple making love in public, but really in public, not in the discreet park or whatever, like on a bus, on a streetcar. And how people look, if you look around, most of the people first are surprised, then they continue, like they are in the private space, ignore it. And this would be my answer if you ask the right question. It's totally wrong, ideological, when we claim, oh my God, with all this public control, digital media, we are losing privacy. No, public space proper is disappearing. The tragedy today is that when you sit behind your PC, even if you are connected with thousands, you are still in private space. And this is what, in a way, Kant knew when he distinguished private and public use of reason. Here, as both of you put it, we cannot bypass philosophy. Philosophy still provides the categories to translate our authentic, and we shouldn't underestimate it, this authentic ethical surprise. My God, how can this happen? You know, to conceptualize it.
I would like to remind everybody that by 8 o'clock, Žižek has to leave to go to the JFK airport.
And I will be so hypocritical. I would like to stay with you till 1 in the club. But unfortunately.
But I'm going to therefore restrict the conversation among the panelists to a few questions. Do either of you or have any questions for Slavoj or either one of you to each other?
Questions. Yeah. I already asked them questions.
I heard you.
So I
would you like to answer his questions?
Yeah, I renounce.
Okay. Well, I will start with the mention that you made of Lenin's materialism, imperial criticism. And one of the things that we've been debating back and forth about in terms of the relationship between materialism and the natural sciences has to do with which natural sciences enjoy pride of place. And you've been quite adamantly defending the priority of quantum physics over anything else. And you tell me sometimes cut the Darwinian crap, etc. But yes.
This is bourgeois propaganda.
Why don't you speak into the microphone so people can hear you?
I'm not tempted, I will do it like this.
So I'll say that I don't see there being any mutual exclusivity between a contemporary materialism that faces up to the challenges posed by quantum physics and at the same time also engages with what is happening in the life sciences in terms of both evolutionary theory, neuroscience, and even genetics too. So yeah, I think that there's no problem there.
But please,
the question
transcendental
of
materialism.
Yes, transcendental materialism. Now, there are 3 answers I'm tempted to fall back on that I'll briefly mention, but I don't think they're the real answers. First, I think you yourself provide a lovely definition of this in Less Than Nothing, right? You have the section in the Ontology of Quantum Physics where you use the very phrase and you say, here's essentially what it means in terms of thinking the immanence of transcendental subjectivity to the ontological level of substance and how that forces a change in how we conceptualize substance or nature itself. Yes, it is. But of course, using a different phrase brings out sides of Hegel that have been fully eclipsed by the history of his reception, including thanks to Pippin and others who don't have any truck with this side of him whatsoever. So in a certain sense, it's talking about what a particular version of Hegel modified in response to post-Hegelian developments, especially in other fields, would look like. So there's that answer. The second answer would be that, this perhaps you come up with a phrase and it starts to function a bit like, the briefcase in Pulp Fiction or Hitchcock's MacGuffin, where it signals a sense of how things come together in terms of a number of different argumentative strands that you can't quite put your finger on, and that it has a certain mystery to it that, of course, requires you to revisit it again and again. But that's not, I think I can make it very precise, though. And the really precise version is to say that this is a matter of, all right, thinking, reflective subjectivity is itself fully immanent to the ontological level of substance, and that would involve reactivating the program of German idealism, especially a la Schelling and Hegel. But in doing so, to say that if this is done in a materialist way, that one has to look at the link between subjectivity and substance in specific areas, and in particular, I think biology enjoys a certain pride of place there that quantum physics would not have, right? And so I think if you're going to account for the manner in which you might say nature denaturalizes itself, becomes self-reflective, etc., that there I think that certain sciences rather than others are the ones that have to be turned to, and that's why I would say there is a priority of the life sciences as dealing with the mid-scale objects that human beings are that has to be taken very seriously. But this ends up, though, with a materialism that looks very similar, though, to what you were pleading for at the start, which is one that holds to the reality of things like infinity, etc., but can explain them in a way that requires no recourse to dualism, idealism, theisms, etc. And in that way, it's close to your own project, which, of course, I invented the phrase to describe in my book on your ontology, and to certain aspects of Badiou's Logics of Worlds when he talks about materialist dialectics.
Thanks. Basically, you are throwing my own sheet back to my face. I agree.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
So, in response to Slavoj's remarks, I would just like to first of all, make a methodological distinction that I think is instructive, parsing some of the differences in approach. So I specified 4 main philosophical provocations that follow from sort of basic implications of Darwinism, and those 4 were the following: that the living is essentially dependent on the non-living, that there can be no essential demarcations of humans from other animals, that animated intention is impossible without mindless, inanimate repetition, and that life is an utterly contingent and destructible phenomenon. So if one accepts those 4 things as philosophical implications of the notion of evolution, and you want a philosophical account to be responsive to those, I think there are 2 very different routes one can take. One is then to mobilize the empirical sciences in order to debunk certain philosophical presuppositions. And that's part of Adrian's strategy. What I was trying to do was something very different, namely like work from within philosophical concepts to construct a notion of, say, temporality, living, and so on, that is responsive to those implications, but doesn't authorize itself in the name of the sciences, but rather produces a philosophical account that is compatible with and consistent with that. And that speaks to, I think, Slavoj's observation about what Derrida does in his work on animality. When he treats philosophers' treatment of animals, he does precisely this. Instead of amassing, say, empirical evidence about that there's no essential separation between humans and other animals, he looks at how this distinction is articulated philosophically, and he tries to show internally the contradictions of that approach, and thereby bring out the philosophical stakes of the question. And when you pursue that route, then you're no longer authorizing yourself in the classical materialist way with reference to the sciences. You're rather doing internal conceptual philosophical work, and that's what I was trying to spell out.
I just want to intervene a little bit here. In the first place, one of the things that may have been a little, if not obscure, a little bit unexplained as to why Lenin's Materialism and Imperial Criticism is considered by Žižek to be a lousy book. It is an example of mechanical materialism. No, I mean, I just want to explain to the audience because people don't. Lenin, before he is sitting in Switzerland in 1916 and he reads Hegel's Logic, is a follower of his master. His master in philosophy was Plekhanov. And Plekhanov was a mechanical materialist. I mean, his understanding of the dialectic and his understanding of Hegel was at the very least minimal. And his work deeply influenced Lenin. One of the things that people don't realize is that we have a famous scientist, you've heard of him, Albert Einstein. He read from Ernst Mach a very interesting speculation, and I'm going to get to the point in a minute, but that speculation was the theory of relativity. And what he set about to do from Mach was to actually give it a mathematical form and to refine it. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of this kind of thinking is that if you depend on the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, as they presently exist, and do not take the European 19th century conception of science, which includes philosophy, then what you do is you rigorously exclude speculation. And if you rigorously exclude speculation, what you have done is you have sunk into a version of mechanical materialism. Any further questions?
No, can I jump in? So, to avoid misunderstanding, I hope we are on the same level here. My God, I wrote a book, a selection of texts of Lenin, so it's not a question of dismissing...
No, I'm not dismissing Lenin entirely.
Yeah, dismissing Lenin. But, you know, I totally agree with you. You know where I would also see Lenin's limit? Like, you know, Lenin is obsessed by this typically Kantian, but in a bad sense, approach like, we are here caught in our representation, and is there reality independently out there? But no, my answer is not the idealist one. It's not out there, it's just in my mind, but it is out there. But we are also out there, part of it. You know, the problem of Lenin is he isn't aware. The way he talks, he reproduces this mechanical dualism. As if we are here, reality is out there, we basically reflect it, and then this, oh my God, can we jump over our shadow? We don't have to jump, we are out there.
All we have to do, by the way, is read Hegel's phenomenology differently than has been read even by Marx early, and we begin to get an understanding of what you have just said. Hegel does argue that, that consciousness and its object are really in many ways dialectically linked. And while it may be considered a version of absolute idealism, which I think is external to Hegel's thinking, that's and it gets its apogee in the philosophy of right. What is true is that the world, and we've been talking about nature, the world and us are not different. We are not different. Which is not to say that we're identical, but we're variations of the same thing. Adorno says, for example, that he is a product of natural history. He always said that. He said, which is the rejection of the Kantian mind-body, mind-nature distinction. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that there are no differences, and that those differences are significant, but they're significant within the content of the natural world. The concept is not one of an antinomy. That's really a very important distinction, and most people aren't up to that yet, unfortunately. Any further questions between you?
Well, I actually wanted to respond to one other point, which had to do with when Slavoj, you signaled your agreement with Pippin about Marx as being too Aristotelian in his early period.
That's the specific point.
Yes, I know that.
Don't worry, when we take over, Pippin goes to Gulag. We agree here. That's the specific point.
Well, I think that well, first of all, I think that Marx's appeal to Gattungswesen, in this Feuerbachian vein prior to 1845, I think that already on its own terms is formulated in his 1844 manuscripts, can be salvaged.
Can be?
Yes.
Okay, here we have a small difference.
It can be salvaged. But in addition, I think that one has to keep in mind that contra Althusser, I don't agree with the Althusserian thesis of the 1845 break, that what happens is that you see when Marx and Engels get very excited with Darwin after, Origin of Species comes out.
Because do you know that Marx wanted to dedicate Capital to Darwin, but Darwin privately conservative.
And then you have Engels' speech at Marx's graveside.
We got to get to the audience.
All right,
okay?
well,
I'm sorry.
Good.
I'm sorry.
I took.
We are your audience. We are like communist leaders. We know better than you what is good for you.
I take my direction from the Central Committee. Yes.
I have this question to Žižek. So whether it's transcendental materialism or some other form of materialism that Lacan introduces, how should we start the dialogue with sciences, with politics about this new materialism and introduce this idea that, I think Lacan made the most public, but if you could say how this dialogue or this discourse can be started about kind of reinventing the materialism based on his existentialism.
This is a very difficult question, and I would prefer not to bluff too much and confess publicly that I cannot give you now, I admit it openly, I cannot give you a clear blueprint. The only way, and I think we all agree here, literally all, sincerely, is that although the thesis is recently popular with some vulgar, not good Darwinists, or even quantum people like Stephen Hawking, in his last bestseller, I forgot the name, he says at the very beginning, now science, so-called science, is able to formulate questions which were once the privilege of philosophy, metaphysics, the origin of the universe, what is thinking, so philosophy is dead. I agree here, no. I claim that Hawking himself is the proof of it. After these disparaging remarks, who needs philosophy is dead, then when he defines his own approach, he does it as a such, what he proposes, a couple of lines, I quote this in the chapter of quantum physics, I think of my less than nothing, it's such vulgar instrumental utilitarianism that it's absolutely not strong enough even to recapture the ontological, epistemological consequences of what he himself is doing later in the book. So, I'm afraid if I disappoint you, but I'm not talking about any patronization of sciences. They are, some of them at least, very bright guys. There are guys who are not bright, like Steven Pinker. We agree. He really simplified so much too, but there are guys who are very bright. So it's not a question of we know more, but philosophical dimension is absolutely needed. Science will not do the entire job. That's all I can say now reasonably. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I've got a question for Adrian Johnston, actually. In terms of nothing qua being dependent on language, I'm curious if negativity is something does it signify something's missing ontologically or phylogenetically or both, and which comes first? Because in certain places you seem to say that being is exiled because of language, but yet it seems that in transcendental materialism, it's the rupture within the biological that occurs first.
Yes, that ultimately on the evolutionary scale, I would say it's that something goes wrong, there's a rupture or break that happens at the level of the quote-unquote natural that then gives rise to what subsequently achieves a degree of independence from its natural origins or grounds, and we can think of as the phylogenetic and ontogenetic dimensions of specifically human history as irreducible to, yet not ontologically different in kind from nature in this altered sense. Now, Slavoj and I are both on the same page with the idea that, so to speak, the gesture of naturalization is a sword that slices in two directions, not just one. It isn't simply a matter of a kind of mechanical or eliminative move in which you reduce down in one way only, but that, of course, to have a science and a vision of nature that includes the weird sorts of subjects that we are requires actually altering the very image of nature that the sciences perhaps were presupposing over the course of their history up through the present. And so Lacan himself formulates the question in the time of his 11th seminar as, well, what would a science be like that included psychoanalysis and the sorts of strange subjects that are, of course, the foci of analytic concerns, both clinical and theoretical. So in that sense, you could think of this move as almost like I use the phrase Trojan horse in the paper, that by, rendering all of this imminent to nature, by naturalizing it in that sense, there's a reciprocal demand that the very notion of nature be transformed so as to accommodate this. Now, as far as negativity or nothingness being introduced by language, I don't think that's Lacan's position even. Lacan says certain things that Malher is latching onto in that, when he issues that statement. But if you look at whether it be the idea of the disharmonies that are involved in the body in pieces, whether you look at it in terms of the triad of castration, privation, and frustration as first introduced in his fourth seminar on the object relation, you'll see that Lacan is trying to develop a notion at the level of a realist materialism of what, if you go back to, for instance, already Locke's essay concerning human understanding, he refers to as privative causality. And then you have, of course, Kant famously treat this, in his early essay on his pre-critical piece from 1763 on negative magnitudes, and then, of course, this comes up in the Amphiboly of the Concepts of Reflection, closing the Transcendental Analytic. And there's this whole history behind the idea of what would a science be that wasn't positivistic in the sense of only thinking in terms of present, incarnate, here and now, bodies governed by laws of mechanical motion in terms of efficient causality. And a reference that you'll find interesting here, and this is the last thing I'll say, a recently published book by a biological anthropologist at Berkeley, this fellow Terence Deacon. He released this book entitled Incomplete Nature, How Mind Emerged from Matter. And he likewise, in a way that I think can be linked up with Lacan's question, what would a science be that included psychoanalysis? He asks, well, how do we account for a causal role of absence, lack, etc., that science, modern science, tracing back to Bacon and Galileo, doesn't really seem to leave room for? And so he wants to, in a way, reactivate at the level of sciences and their ontology, something along the lines of privative causality and its history and philosophy. And that is, I think, something that should be borne in mind here in terms of how I'm operating.
May I just add a very short phrase? I'll be very short because it's crucial about this phylogenetic approach, evolution. But nonetheless, there is a problem with phylogenetic approach in that when you say a smooth story about how something emerges, you can reintroduce a secret teleology, which what both of you already emphasized, which is why it has to emphasize, as Stephen Jay Gould is, that Darwin is not a kind of a evolutionary progressist or whatever. It's utter, you know what I want to say here? The following, that remember that this is the failure, the limitation of traditional phylogenetic, where you tell the smooth story. Marx himself, you remember, at the end of chapter 1 of Capital and elsewhere, when he provides this primal accumulation, he openly says, this is a myth, continuous myth. And remember what Marx says in Introduction to Grundrisse. It may appear as shocking to those who believe in phylogenesis in this cheap evolutionary sense as to understand something, you must tell its genesis. Are you aware that Marx says exactly the opposite? In his famous statement, the anatomy of a man is the key to the anatomy of the ape. It's not teleology. It just means that man emerged out of ape, not out of some secret teleology, but contingently. Yes. Which is why you cannot deploy in an immanent evolutionary way some kind of progress of nature. That's my only reserve towards phylogenetic approach. Don't confuse it with this secretly teleological evolution.
Yes, go ahead.
Sadly, we're...
No, excuse me. I'm sorry. We have a lot of people waiting. I appreciate your comments, but I think we need to hear from some more people. Go ahead.
Thank you for the great talk. 3 questions, one to each of you. Zizek, I'll make it quick though. Zizek, I wanted to know why you put Tahrir Square with the public bus as 2 ways of thinking about public space, because it seems like the impossible becoming possible in Tahrir Square was possible because of the condition of the possibility of the oppression of the people being represented in such a way that they would be able to come together and start a public space. It wasn't based off of nothing, it was based off of the possibility of the oppression being handled in a public manner. Where it seems like in the public bus, what we're seeing is, yes, we're seeing the conditions of oppression, namely the possibility of human relations suffering because they don't know how to interact with one another. And of course we would then go back to ourselves because we wouldn't have the possibility of beginning to form ourselves on a public space where we saw the possibility of our suffering being made sense of. Adrian, I wanted to understand why it is that you saw in the relation of the myth of the non-given, the lack of, I'll just throw 3 questions out and that's it. The lack of the non-given, why you don't see a critique of materiality needing to be necessary there, why you leave it on a mystical ground. Why don't you show the mystical as a certain way of taking up materiality instead of it just being a mystical critique of the mystical? Martin?
No, wait a minute. No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
2 questions is 1 too many, but it's perfectly fine. But let's stop because we have, 5 more minutes. Yeah.
No, you first. I talk too much, I admit it.
Well, the short answer is I think that what I laid out in terms of my presentation, the myth of the non-given, would still allow room for, being able to come up with, if I understand your question correctly, come up with an account of these, what I'm labeling in a, obviously in a provocative, pejorative fashion, mystical versions of negativity. Certainly it would, my position would not require dismissing those as utterly negligible. In fact, part of what I want to do is to show that you can capture so much of what is enshrined in religious, spiritualist, idealist, etc. traditions, but without having to subscribe to any kind of what I think philosophically and scientifically problematic sort of ground zero axioms underpinning your position that would involve in some way or another being a dualist, an outright idealist, etc. That you can account for the imminent material genesis of what previously seemed only accountable for in a way that would require a non-materialist approach. And in this, I'm faithful to the marks of the 11 Theses on Feuerbach, specifically the first thesis, where he talks about the difference between contemplative materialism up to and including Feuerbach, and then the new sort of materialism that he is struggling to articulate, that would not just dismiss all of what came before as illusion, etc., but would show why the idealist temptation exists and be able to account for it without reducing away in an unsatisfactory fashion those things that we want to hold on to that are reflected in religion, etc.
2 phrases. Really. First, when you spoke about mystic, we should, I agree with you, but also in a critical sense, namely in the sense that, and I think this is crucial today, we should recognize and not even necessarily some kind of fallen, non-authentic form of the sacred mystical experience in phenomena which can be quite low. I think that there is not necessarily anything great in spiritual, like 2 provocative examples. Did you see that shitty movie Project X? Young nerds organizing an orgy, a party which go, that's sorry, the experience of sacred today. Let me go even more further. Were you affected by that ultimate madness, the song which is now a mega hit, Gangnam Style? I'm sorry, this is sacred today. Public space, I don't have time to go into this, just this, that I hope my point was clear. Public sex for me works in a Budapest streetcar precisely because it remains private space. Stop, I don't have time
Good.
now.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much. I have a question for Adrian Johnston. I'm curious what you make of Julia Kristeva's theory of the semiotic and the somatic biological origin of psychic urges which inform our language, and where that fits into your...
The short answer, and I think that we're constrained to short answers at this point, the short answer is that I consider Kristeva's version of the semiotic symbolic distinction as introduced in, for example, Revolution in Poetic Language, to be basically a newfangled version of Bergsonism. And that if you go back and you read the Bergson of, say, Time and Free Will or Creative Evolution, etc., you'll see that, basically all of the conceptual machinery is in place for a lot of what Kristeva is after. And I consider her treatment of, and I think this is a problem with those continental philosophers, many of whom talk about embodiment, that they don't want to actually get down to grappling with how the body is dealt with at the level of biology. And they have various moves for avoiding that, whether it's to appeal to a distinction between, the lived phenomenal body, and then there's just the inert stuff studied by biology. That's, of course, a caricature of the natural sciences then, and even more so now. And so for me, in a sense, it's that since I consider the Bergsonian model to be very problematic, I have great difficulty going along with Kristeva, and I think that she also, there are certain weaknesses in her account of embodiment that are shared with, for instance, the Merleau-Pontian phenomenological embodiment tradition and other variations on this idea of a body that nonetheless somehow can't be captured by the sciences, etc. But that's a short answer.
You got the last word.
Hi. So I'll just lay my cards on the table right away. I'm not an academic and I'm not a philosopher.
We are also not academics, even if
You're a spontaneous philosopher, as somebody once said.
That's the domain that interests me as far as asking this question of Žižek. I was talking to a friend of mine about something that you had said. I wasn't there, but you said something at Zuccotti Park about kind of like nostalgia and about the danger of as he described it to me, of looking at things that have happened in the past, for example, political movements and whatnot, like, the 20s and we were young then, or the 60s or the whatever it is, or even like last year or 2 years ago or whatever it is, instead of like being in the present. And so I was just wondering if you could say something about that, about nostalgia or about,
Since I have minus half a minute and I would have to run back in time to answer, I will be really very, it all amounts to this. Whenever you have this ecstatic movement, 500,000 of people on the street, yeah, it's nice, but I am obsessed by, with all alcoholic connotations, the morning after. It's easy to organize a big orgy, we cry, wonderful, and so on. But, for me, a true political event is measured by later, when things return to normal. How does it really affect everyday life? For example, in this sense, I'm not a pessimist. With all the shit I know how 68 was reappropriated in this new dynamic capitalism and so on. But wait a minute, the way we treat women now, the way we treat minorities and so on, there is some achievement. You simply cannot publicly talk, dismiss, till 68. It was, I remember, I was young then, not now. It was quite possible to talk publicly about, rape, it's ambiguous, who knows, maybe women secretly enjoy it, all that bullshit, But what I'm saying is that this is what interests me, and that was my point of critique. My nightmare was this one. There was Zuccotti Park, it goes away, and then, we will meet every 5 years in a cafeteria. My God, it was nice there. And then, while we are talking, my cell phone would ring up. Sorry, guys, I have to run to the bank, to my job. I don't have... and this is for me the key problem of the left today in this sense that, look, it's a crisis going on. And I'm not talking about detailed answers, but does the left really know, at a very general level, I want to end with a provocation, what does it want? That's why we have this moralism, financial capital, greedy bankers. Bankers were always greedy. This doesn't interest me. The point is what changed in the system that they can now, you know what I mean? This idea of what do we want? Do we want a little bit more Keynesian capitalism, you know, a little bit more healthcare, blah, blah, whatever? Is this enough? Or, because, you know, the 20th century is over in all its tragedy and greatness. Stalinist communism doesn't work. Even the old-fashioned social democratic welfare state doesn't work, and so on and so on. It's a serious problem, and we will confront it, like in Greece. I was with Syriza a week before elections, and after talking to them, I'm almost tempted to say it's horrible. Maybe it was good that they lost, you know, like they really didn't have an idea what to do. I was a bad influence of them, because I told them, screw enthusiasm, think about secret police, financial terror, and so on. If Syriza were to take power, you know, capital would start running around and so on. They would have needed tremendous repressive apparatuses. And I was not calling for police terror. I was saying, if we don't invent a way how to deal with this, then either we or someone else will really have to do it in Stalinist or totalitarian way. I stop. I'm sorry.
I would like to thank our panelists.
Thank you.
And the audience. Thanks very much, folks.